name is Terry Charman, and I'm the senior historian at the Imperial War Museum, London.
Terry, we're surrounded by the sounds and sights of the home front. Now, we're not talking Dad's Army a la the TV programme, but we're going back to an earlier era. How come?
Well, what is very interesting, I've just written this book, The First World War on the Home Front, and what surprised me, although perhaps I shouldn't have been surprised, was that everything that we're very familiar with about the Second World War home front, Dame Vera Lynn's songs, the air raids, the sheltering in the tube during those air raids, the songs, the reviews, not radio, of course, because that hadn't been invented during the First World War, but so much, and rationing, blackout, everything we think, and the Home Guard, Dad's Army, everything had a precursor during the earlier conflict in 1914-18. And a lot of the experiences of 1914-18 were picked up on and developed again during the Second World War. So, for example, in December 1916, Lloyd George creates the Ministry of Food Control. Now, that's quite a bit into the First World War. The Second World War, the Ministry of Food is set up again on the day that war is declared. And it's interesting too, an amazing fact, that the most iconic image of Britain during the Blitz, apart from St Paul's Cathedral, is that of the Londoners sheltering in the tube, in the underground, during the air raids, during the Blitz. And it's reckoned that every night in September 1940, at the height of the Blitz, 177,000 Londoners were sheltering thus. During the First World War, double that number were sheltering in the underground.
Astonishing. Why? There were more people alive there?
Well, not more people alive. I think one's got to remember that there weren't Anderson shelters, there weren't the domestic shelters that you had in the Second World War. And in fact, when the war began, George Bernard Shaw wrote to the editor of the Times and said that air raid shelters should be created for children's use. And the editor of the Times refused to publish his letter because he said no civilised person would bomb children and civilians. And of course, German air raids on Britain, first of all by Zeppelin, start in January 1915, and then they progress, if that's the right word to use, to the bombing of London by what was called the Gotha bombers and the Giant bombers between May 1917 and May 1918. And they caused a lot of damage, not necessarily when compared with the Blitz. A lot of human lives were lost, though every human life lost, of course, is a tragedy. But they caused the same feeling of London can take it that you had in 1940, 1941. And there was the Volunteer Training Corps, which was the Dad's Army of the First World War.
Who coined Dad's Army?
I'm never very sure. I don't know whether it was Jimmy Croft for the TV series in the late 1960s, early 70s, because I don't think that it was actually applied to the Home Guard during the Second World War. I've never seen it in that context, although we had a very successful exhibition here in my first year at the Imperial War Museum way back in 1974 called The Real Dad's Army, when the entire cast turned up to the opening, and Anthony Eden, Lord Avon, who was Secretary of State for War in Churchill's wartime coalition in the first few months, he was the person that in his radio broadcast called the Home Guard into being, although it was then called the Local Defence Volunteer, nicknamed Look, Duck and Vanished. Churchill insisted, though, and he really did insist, that it should be called the Home Guard. And that's, of course, a much better name for it. It's interesting, I think that shows sort of part of Churchill's genius. In the Second World War, there were British restaurants which were originally going to be called communal feeding centres. And Churchill said, don't call them that. That smacks of communism and the workhouse. Call them British restaurants. And in the First World War, there were national kitchens and national restaurants that started in 1917 to provide cheap food and cheap meals for people all over the United Kingdom. And Queen Mary and her daughter, Princess Mary, the Princess Royal, opened the first national kitchen in the Westminster Bridge Road literally yards from the Imperial War Museum where we're speaking now. And I think actually the site of it is now the Chicken Kitchen fast food takeaway place. So it has a very honourable ancestry.
So history tends to repeat itself. In what way was the First World War Home Guard different to the Second? Were they again ill-equipped to start with? They had no equipment. They had to go around in a...
It is exactly like it was in May 1940. I include in my book an account by an officer in the Volunteer Training Corps in the early days of the First World War, when there was a genuine fear of a German landing on the east coast.
What sort of landing? A ship landing?
Yes,
no.
Well, they had fighter pilots and observation balloon pilots had parachutes, and some of the early bomber crews, but and not the Royal Flying Corps, because it was thought that would be tantamount to encouraging men to jump out of the machines. But the Germans, the French had parachutes. We did towards the end of the war. There was a very successful play in 1909 called An Englishman's Home, which depicted a fictitious, although it's pretty reckoned to be a German invasion of Britain in the near future, and how an Essex household react to this invasion.
Well, we're from Essex.
And you're from Essex, but there was a doggerel, though, that accompanied the play, or a reflection on the play. I was playing golf the day the Germans landed, and all our men had run away, and all our ships were stranded, and the thought of England's shame very nearly spoilt my game.
Brilliant. Where in Essex did this originate from, did you say?
I don't know where it's an Essex household that is depicted in the play, because it was assumed the Germans would invade on the east coast.
Could be Southend.
Yes.
There's always a theory of invasion
could be.
there.
And of course in my book I recount the terrible air raid on Southend in August 1917, and accompanying a photograph as an accompanying photograph of one of the young victims of the raid, because although the casualty figures were mercifully small during the First World War compared to the Blitz, about less than 1,500 British civilians were killed by German bombing. Nevertheless, you can imagine the shock at the time. And the men that flew planes, like the Sopwith Camel there, that went up to take on the German air raiders, were seen as the real heroes. They were the first of the few, really.
Especially the Zeppelin pilots, Leif Robinson, and
it's amazing. Leif Robinson can hear the crowds cheering him, and he says, "Who's the cause of this? As this airships descending into flames?" And he puts it so modestly, "Only little me." Yes, and I'm so very proud that my paternal grandfather was fighting on the Western Front with the Royal Fusiliers right the way through the First World War, but my maternal grandfather worked for the Sopwith Aviation Company, which of course produced the Sopwith Camel, the most successful Allied fighter of the First World War. And I found at home, only a few months back, this cigarette case in the politically incorrect days of the First World War, or post-First World War, where it was presented to him for services rendered between 1914 and 1918.
What was the dear gentleman's name?
His name was Alfred Newman, and I dedicate the book to him and to my grandmother, Alfred and Nellie Newman, as I put it, two warriors on the home front, because my grandmother was also working at Sopwith towards the end of the First World War.
Tell us a bit more about this heroic couple on the home front.
Well, I don't think that my grandparents, who were very modest people, would have even thought themselves heroic. I mean, my grandfather, say, wasn't in the army, but he was one of the many millions of people that was essential, actually, who weren't in the army, who turned out the munitions of war, and in his case, of course, the aircraft, which made, of course, Britain the most dominant air power in the world by the end of the First World War, when the Royal Air Force was created on the 1st of April 1918, the world's first air force, when we had thousands of aircraft, when we'd started the war with just a few score planes. And he and my grandmother were part of a very large army of munitioneers and munitionettes, as the women were called, who produced the weapons that eventually won the war. And of course we have a Minister of Munitions, but the first one was Lloyd George, whose energy, ruthlessness at times brought about a terrific increase in Britain's munitions. And the last wartime Minister of Munitions was Winston Churchill, brought back by his friend David Lloyd George from the political wilderness to become Minister of Munitions. And Churchill's energy, ferocious energy, is there in 1917, 1918. Germans launch their March offensive, the army loses a lot of equipment, and under Churchill's dynamic leadership, that equipment is replaced and over-replaced, and more than replaced.
How much of the material did you manage to get from your grandparents? Because often children of those who have served in the war, or your grandparents, you don't really take much notice of them until it's too late.
Sadly, there's very, very little left. There's a photograph of their wedding in April 1919, because in those days were very long engagements, I think 5 years in the case of my grandparents. But it's interesting, there are my grandmother's two young brothers who had both been in the army and rushed out to France to stem that German advance in 1918, and another one of her brothers who'd been in the Royal Navy with Admiral David Beattie's the Grand Fleet.
Presumably one of them is your father.
Well, they were my maternal grandparents. My father's father was, say, with the Royal Fusiliers out in France for almost the entire war. But my father features in the book because he vividly remembered, he lived to the great age of 95, he vividly remembered queuing with his mother to get potatoes during the U-boat offensive when the food supplies were very short. Potatoes from the store in Kingston upon Thames, Bentall's, which is still there. The housewives of Kingston queued right over Kingston Bridge to get their allotment of potatoes. My father was there, and he also remembered the big German air raid on London on the 7th of July 1917. He was in his grandparents' garden, again not all that very far from the Imperial War Museum in the Old Kent Road, and he remembered, I recall him saying, that this flock, as he put it, of German Gotha bombers flying back after having successfully raided London. And in the Imperial War Museum's collection there is a painting of that event, and it almost fits exactly my father's description of this V-shaped flock of returning bombers with the British anti-aircraft fire, or Archie as it was called in the First World War, Flak in the Second, but Archie in the First World War, after a song by the leading music hall comedian George Roby.
Give us a turn of it.
Archibald, certainly not.
So are there any Gothas left anywhere in the world?
I don't think so. There might be copies, but I don't think there are any replicas. I mean, unfortunately, the museum had a large collection of aircraft which were put on display when we first opened at the Crystal Palace in June 1920, when the present Queen's grandfather opened it. But when the museum had to move to the Imperial Institute, a lot of those aircraft were either sold off, and even worse in these days of conservation, where we're so conservation conscious, they were cut up for firewood after models of them were made. And although models are pretty accurate and very good, no substitute for the real thing. So a Sopwith 1.5 strutter, and that's the sound of one going over now probably, a Sopwith 1.5 strutter, which my grandfather went up in on a demonstration test flight. There's one, I think, existing in America, and one in the Brussels Military Museum, the aviation part. It's so sad that those but it is very, very, very lucky to have this Zeppelin killer, Zepp killer, that brought down a Zeppelin in August 1918. And again, it's very nice of the fact we are the Imperial War Museum, with the Commonwealth War Museum, that the plane was flown by a Canadian pilot, a youngster, only 18 years of age.
And he became a hero, and the plane was immediately impounded to tour the country?
Well, I don't know if it toured the country, but certainly formed part of the collection of the Imperial War Museum almost right from the start when we opened in June 1920. The museum itself had been founded in March 1917, the idea of, as it then was, a national war museum to cover the ongoing conflict. But because we had General Smuts from South Africa in the Imperial War Cabinet, because Lord Beaverbrook, the Canadian newspaper magnate, was British Minister of Information in Lloyd George's government, it was felt that we should record the Empire's effort, and that's why we're called the Imperial War Museum. So we cover the vast effort of the then self-governing white dominions, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, South Africa. Of course, it was only the white people ruling in South Africa at the time, Newfoundland, which was then a separate colony, the Indian Empire, which raised an all-volunteer force of 1.5 million men, and the smaller colonies, Hong Kong, Malta, Gibraltar, the West Indies, all contributed to the empire's cause. Because in those days, of course, almost a quarter of the world's surface was covered by the British Empire, owing allegiance to the King Emperor in London.
Going back to the grassroots of the home front, did they have similar dig for victory? Did they collect all the metal fencing and melt them down?
They didn't collect metal fencing in the same way that it was collected during the Second World War salvage drives, but there were salvage drives in Britain during the First World War, again towards the end of the conflict rather than at the beginning as the salvage was collected in 1939-40, because again one's got to remember all these things had a precursor during the First World War, and the lessons learned between 40 and 18 were in lots of ways very quickly applied in 1939-1940. And to say there was rationing, people were told to dress with modesty rather than extravagantly, and there was ideas for utility clothing, which again comes in 1941-42. But they're talking about standardised men's suits, but not women's clothes. The government fights shy of that. Whether Lloyd George's mistress and secretary Francis Stevenson had a hand in that. And it said anybody that introduces standardised women's clothing in the year that women have been given the vote would be a very, very foolish politician. And Lloyd George was not a foolish politician. As John Grigg pointed out in his marvellous biography of Lloyd George can said when he comes to power in December 1916 can be said to have been confronted by as dark a situation as when Churchill became Prime Minister on the 10th of May 1940. I mean, admittedly, there wasn't a situation where our most immediate ally, France, fell as it was about to fall in May and June 1940, but one ally, Russia, was almost out of the war. The German U-boat campaign is soon to get underway. Britain is in some danger of starvation. In some cases, food supplies were only in some days off from being totally denuded. So I think, there was a lot, and 1917 is a very, very grim as well as a very optimistic year in the war.
But on the home front, it was a lot safer for people in the First World War. There weren't the huge Luftwaffe raids. There were the Gophers, there were airships occasionally dropping small bombs in the right place.
Yes.
But we're not talking about total war.
No, one has to be careful. 25 German bombers in 1918 kill 162 people. First day of the Blitz, 350 German bombers kill nearly 500 people. Now, if you think of the ratios, I think that says it, doesn't it, really?
Why? What? That must be an odd ratio. I mean, surely there were...
Well, if the Germans had been able to have sent over 300 bombers in 1918, and if 25 cost 162 deaths, going on that basis, the number of deaths would have been much greater than during the Blitz.
It must be the Anderson shelters.
I think that was it, yes.
And the shelters in the back gardens.
Yes.
They did not exist.
No, they didn't exist in the First World War.
Where did people hide then? If they were in London, they could go in the underground.
Yes, and government buildings opened and government buildings opened their cellars. But you see, also in the First World War, again, Churchill's genius. In September 1914, he issues to the cabinet a minute saying that Britain ought to create, and this is long before we're raided by German bombers, we ought to create what in the Second World War was called ARP, Aero Precautions or Civil Defence. And there wasn't any organisation like that. But there were the Special Constabulary, 30,000 in Britain, and my grandfather's father, Alfred Newman, his father, John Alfred Newman, who'd been in the colonial police force, joins up again as a special constable in Kingston upon Thames. And I'm very pleased to say that his photograph is in our collection, sitting on a bench wearing his uniform, cap, whistle and truncheon. I've got the whistle and truncheon at home, and I suppose I better donate them to the Imperial War Museum before I retire.
One day. Can we go and see this photograph?
Well,
it's here.
It's in the. I don't know if it's digitalised. I don't know if I.
Oh, so it's not on show?
No.
Oh, sadly. So when you get it, they'll put it. Hopefully, you'll pull a few strings.
I'll try and get it. Yeah.
So
try to get it in there.
Tell us a bit more about the book now. Who's published it? Where we can buy it from? Tell us a bit more.
Yes. Well, the book. There it is. The First World War on the home front. And
how long did it take to write?
It took, I suppose, physical effort. It takes me a long time to write. Researching it, writing it, probably a year, but that was in between. It was done in museum time, so that my other duties.
Was it planned with the anniversary of the First World War?
Oh yes, it was. Our publishing department. I'd written a book about the outbreak of the Second World War that coincided with an exhibition that we had here in 2009, and our publishing department asked if I had another idea, and I said because we always see the First World War through the prism of the Western Front, how about the home front? And so they said that was a good idea, and it was Carlton Books, with whom I've worked with the museum on a number of works, including the late Professor Richard Holmes's First World War and Second World War in pictures. They took up the idea, liked it, and it's a publishing house under their imprint, Andre Deutsch. And I was very pleased that some of the writers and historians that I've helped in the past were very kind enough to give me a little commendation. So Michael Dobbs, Lord Dobbs, House of Cards books, it said, Terry Charman, and this is, I'm blush with embarrassment, is an inspirational and entertaining historian. The breadth of his knowledge is formidable, and he has an exceptional ability to pass on what he knows. And Anthony Horowitz, the writer in Foyle's War, put for 15 years, Terry Charman has been the secret weapon on Foyle's War.
So when are you going to do a book signing session at the IWM?
Well, I think probably when, as they say, the captains and the kings depart and we have a bit of time to do so. At the moment, we're pretty busy this week. Not that it's an unpleasant duty, but meeting and greeting celebrities, personalities, ladies and gentlemen of the press and the media, but hopefully fairly soon. And the book actually comes out, say, tomorrow, the 16th of